So for this video, I will be fully explaining Armament Haki, its source as in the type of ambition that creates it, the basic nature on how it works, the difference between regular armament coding and hardening, what that black coding is, the details on how Luffy uses armament hardening for Gear 4th, emission, internal destruction, if Tekkai and Shigan from Rokushiki use Armament Haki, and I'll try my best to answer all the questions about armament's visibility. Like, is hardening visible or not to known users of observation haki, and things like that. This is a follow-up to my video on the foundations of haki, so if you haven't, you are advised to watch that first. Armament seems like it would be related to an ambition to be strong. And I realize this can sound a bit simplistic. I did say that the shades of Haki, if they were to be associated with any system of 5 phases or elements, it would probably be Godai from Japanese Buddhism. Specifically for armament, the obvious association would be with the element of earth, Chi, which represents the quality of solidity and resistant to change. The mental or spiritual traits associated with these elements are stability, collectiveness, physicality, desires to resist change, to protect things as they are, and it's foremost linked to the traits of stubbornness and sureness of action. This stubbornness, the sureness of action, resistance to outside forces is necessary to protect things you want to protect, just as it is necessary to be able to keep pressing forward despite outside opposition. After all, what is an unstoppable object if not an immovable object in a different frame of reference? Likewise, it is this same Haki that can serve as an invisible armor for protection, which can be used to strengthen your attacks. So remember that Ki is the essence of everything, even solid things. This means that if you can control the nature of your Ki, you should be able to solidify it. So of course, a person's vital Ki, just being this very ethereal energy, when it's put outside of a person's body, by itself, it's likely to just pour out everywhere. Similarly to what we see happen with Conqueror's Haki. This is why harmonious attunement that generates attractive forces between the user's Haki and their weapon or projectile is necessary to keep the Haki infused to it, bound to it. If you want to coach yourself in it, you need to add some structure to it. You need to add binding forces to it so that it will be held together. Think again about the explanation about the clouds in Skypiea. By strengthening these bonds in the Ki, its state is changed from a very ethereal into a liquid and eventually into solid, and this would explain Armament's hardening ability. To solidify your Haki is what I believe is referred to as hardening. Koka. This ability is first named and at least explicitly shown to us by Luffy during the descent to Fishman Island. An interesting thing about its Japanese name is that it's also used for vulcanization, a thermochemical process used for hardening rubber via the addition of sulfur, which often turns the rubber black due to the addition of carbon to further enhance its properties. So I guess it's fitting that we first see this ability named when used by Luffy to harden his rubber arm, thus also turning it black. There's a lot of confusion around this black coating, but yeah, at least originally it was very clearly used to depict specifically hardening. By covering your body or your weapon with a hardened coating, you can greatly increase its hardness and resistance. This of course is of great use defensively, but it also allows you to deliver much stronger attacks without causing harm to your fist, leg, sword, or whatever else you're hitting your opponent with. Hitting your opponent with a material hardened to be like steel, of course, is also more damaging than hitting with a softer material, such as your own flesh or maybe the not particularly hard material that you control with your devil fruit powers that, due to its softness, will necessarily attenuate some of the impact. By the way, one way that people try to differentiate Armament and Tekkai is by claiming that Armament does not hamper your movement in any way. While I do believe that the effect is more severe with Tekkai for reasons I'll explain further in the video, this solidified Haki coating could absolutely be a detriment to the user's movement, and there is no reason to believe otherwise. Hardly anyone uses full body hardening. Off the top of my head, there's Jinbei, who was completely stationary when he did it, and Virgo and Pika, neither of whom are particularly agile characters. Luffy, specifically in Gear 4, retains a lot of flexibility due to this specifically finely controlled way that he utilizes hardening here, which I'll get more into later, but you can still see how the hardening obviously makes his body stiffer. It's just that he is able to use that to his advantage. But you don't need to actually fully solidify the Haki into hardening to use it. Even after hardening with that visible black coating was introduced, we continued seeing uses of armament coating without it, like when Luffy coated himself in armament to grab Caesar's gas Logia body in Punk Hazard, or when he coated his punches in armament to try to punch Treble, believing that he was a Logia. So if you don't solidify the Haki and instead have it as an intermediate state, is it like a liquid? Well, yeah, but despite the binding forces you added to it, it's still a very ethereal energy. It has practically no weight, so it's not like it's going to drip down from you or anything. And like any liquid, its binding forces keep it at a near constant volume instead of expanding out everywhere, so you can still use it just as well for coating. In fact, unlike the solid armament, it's not going to hamper your movement in any way. But what could a liquid armament coating possibly add? Well, while it's not going to make your hand or weapon harder and stronger, that is still energy you are coating your attack with. It's energy that can be transferred to your target when you strike it with your armament infused attacks, thus greatly increasing your attack's power. If you pay attention, you'll notice that armament coating in attacks does much more than just making the user's fists or sword harder so they can hit with more force without damaging their hand or weapon. It increases the power of the move beyond what it would normally have from its speed and weight alone. That's why the arrows from the Kuja warriors have so much destructive power, even though they are not heavier than regular arrows nor move at crazy high speeds. This is the central point of coating yourself in Haki to begin with, hitting your target directly with your Haki. Remember the distinction I made in the first video between imbuement, coating and emission? Unless you can do emission, coating is how you can have your Haki outside of your body or weapon while still in a dense controlled form, so that it hits your target directly instead of you just physically striking your target. Which is also why armament is used to negate Devil Fruit invulnerabilities, as coating and emission are how you can hit someone directly with a concentrated amount of Haki, and Haki can counter Devil Fruit abilities, the reason for which I can unfortunately only explain when I explain my theory on Devil Fruits. This energy can also cushion against enemy attacks and even blow them away should it be strong enough, like in the case of an emission, and so it also has defensive potential, though as far as the coating goes, certainly not as much as a fully solid, hardened armament coating. Now, if it is this very nature of armament that is necessary to coat yourself or an object with Haki, this would mean that even Conqueror's coating would necessitate one to keep the Haki coated using armament. This might be hinted at by how Kaido in his internal monologue notes that Luffy is clad in both armament and Supreme King Haki. Thus it could be seen as a combination of the properties of armament and Conquerors. This here is kind of a cope in my part, because otherwise the way it is, it seems like armament has just been made obsolete for people who are able to use Conqueror's Haki coating. So you don't need to be using hardening to be using coating. But what about the reverse? Do you need to be using coating to be using hardening? Or could you harden the Haki as it is inside of your body? While that obviously could increase the hardness and the resistance of your body to superhuman levels, it would also make it completely stiff. it would probably make it near impossible to move whatever body part you use the hardening in, way more than just a hardened superficial coating would. Oh yeah, sounds exactly like Tekkai, right? Well, that's because that's likely what it is. Notice how, despite hardening the user's body, the Rokushiki techniques of Tekkai and Shigan do not seem to add any extra power to the user's attacks like armament coating does. They are only used defensively or to harden your body parts like the finger in Shigan to ensure they do not break even when applying enough force to act like bullets. Except of course if you're going against my man Jinbei, but he's built different in a user of blow haki, so he's an exception. Now, since I'm continuing to talk about Rokushiki, let's just clear another misconception. No, it was never stated that Rokushiki abilities come from the user's muscles. Again, a headcanon repeated so frequently in the fandom that it's made its way into the One Piece wiki as if it is canonical, confirmed fact. Here I think translators are at least partially to blame, because I pretty distinctly recall watching Enies Lobby for the first time in the anime, like over a decade ago, and the English subtitles stating things like their legs are so powerful that they are able to kick the air and stuff like that. None of this is in the manga in the original Japanese. And in fact, if you look at it, you would be surprised at how little explanation is actually offered to any of these abilities. For Tekkai, Blueno just says that they can harden their bodies to the point of being like an iron shell. They can increase its resistance. He never says a single thing about muscles. For Geppo, as I stated previously, he just says that they can kick the void, which, quite frankly, I'm not sure if I can blame the translators for interpreting this as kicking air, because without knowing what we went through in this theory, this would probably be confusing as hell. For Shigan, Kaku just says that they don't need bullets to pierce human flesh. For Rankyaku, Nami is surprised at how the wind from their kicks can cut through walls and stuff, and Khalifa just responds that it's possible if it has the speed to form a wind sight. Could she be talking about the speed of their kick? That if you kick with enough speed you create an air sight? I mean, could be, though if this was the case I would be expecting Sanji to be sending wind sights everywhere every time he is in a fight, but it also could be just talking about the speed of the wind itself, that it can act like an air sight and cut through things if it's moving fast enough. Of course, then you have to explain how they're able to kick the wind in that way in the first place, which would be with nature haki, with the breath of air. For Zoro, they just say that they can move so fast that they disappear, and for Kamiya, Blueno just says that they can do more than just tank attacks, then just states the ability's name and starts dodging Luffy's Gatling gun. Literally zero explanation on how this works. And it makes sense why it is like this if you understand the context of this scene. I know it's easy to take for granted villains just going on monologues explaining their abilities and stuff, but there's an actual reason in story why they are stating their abilities here. If you don't remember, the whole reason why Lucci didn't just kill Luffy and Zoro here and just incapacitated them and threw them away like trash is because Robin has struck a deal that she would cooperate with CP9 as long as the Straw Hats were able to leave Water 7 safely. CP9 took this deal because if they hadn't, Robin likely would have managed to escape the government once again like she had done for 20 years prior to this. And this is why they actually bother stating their abilities here. It's not some random monologue to conveniently explain their abilities, it's a show of power. They're stating their abilities to show how much stronger they are than the Straw Hats, to convince them that it is helpless to try to stop them from taking Robin, which is why they don't actually explain how they can do any of this crazy stuff, which is further emphasized by Luffy later when using Zoro against Blueno, stating that he figured out how Blueno does Zoro by watching him. Namely, that Luffy figured out that they could do that by kicking the ground like 10 times really fast. If Blueno had actually explained the abilities and not just stated what they can do, Luffy wouldn't have to figure out anything. But from the side of Rokushiki being a martial arts style that utilizes Haki, and specifically for Tekkai and Shigan, what is the evidence? Well, other than it just making a hell of a lot more sense that it being muscle tension, there is the fact that I mentioned in the first Haki video that Tekkai and Shigan are both based and named after real-life Qigong techniques that claim to use your Qi to reinforce your body, namely Iron Shirt and Iron Finger, and that these techniques are also clearly where Oda got the idea for Armament Haki in the first place. But also, there are the Vivricard databooks. Firstly, all of the former CP9 members who were masters in Rokushiki were confirmed to be users of both Armament and Observation Haki in Volume 10 of the Vivricard databook, released during Wano arc. So did all of them learn Haki over the time skip simultaneously? There will be some impressive dedication and consistency for all of them, since in comparison, only a third of the Straw Hats learn Observation and Armament over the time skip. Secondly, Lucci was originally stated in the same volume to have learned Observation and Armament since he was last seen per time skip. But this was later officially corrected in the index cards volume to him having simply strengthened his Haki related to Rokushiki during the time skip. I find it very unlikely that an official correction would be published just because the headcanon of the editors changed rather than coming directly from Oda. Rather, what I think likely happened is that when making the Vivricards, editors saw or heard from Oda Lucci and other CP9 members listed as users of Armament and Observation, so they wrote that Lucci learned it over the time skip because they assumed, as the vast majority of the fandom does, that he was not a user of Haki pre-time skip. And then it was corrected by Oda that Lucci actually was a user of Haki and only strengthened his Haki related to Rokushiki during the time skip, which by itself, Haki related to Rokushiki kinda implies Rokushiki uses Haki. And finally, to cement this, the index cards state that the training required for the acquisition of both mantra, which we know is Observation Haki, and Rokushiki is akin to that used for acquiring Haki, and includes with that a panel of Lucci using Tekkai. Also, during Jinbei's fight with Who's Who, before Who's Who reveals himself to be a former CP9 member, he uses Soru and Rankyaku against Jinbei, who deflects the attack with Armament Haki, and then asks Who's Who if he should be calling it Tekkai, while brandishing his hardened Armament Haki clad arm. Considering Who's Who hadn't used Tekkai, it seems pretty clear to me that Jinbei is insinuating that Who's Who would refer to Armament Haki as Tekkai. As in the following panel, Jinbei accuses Who's Who, correctly, of being a former CP9 agent. Now, outside of nonsense power scaling claims, the argument that Rokushiki does not use Haki rests mostly on this scene when base Lucci uses Shigan on Luffy's neck, and states that if Luffy wasn't made of rubber, he would have had his neck pierced and died from that attack. Clearly, if Shigan used Armament, Lucci's attack would have negated Luffy's rubber powers and pierced Luffy's neck, so the argument goes. So let's grant that this would be the case if Lucci was using armament coating. Firstly, as I stated before, I don't believe Tekkai and Shigan use armament coating, rather that they harden the Haki inside the body. No coating means the Haki remains inside the user's body, therefore it never touches the target, therefore it doesn't negate devil fruit abilities. Secondly, suppose Lucci could coat his finger with Armament Haki. Even then, in this scene specifically, Lucci would have kept himself from using armament coating because, again, the whole point was not killing Luffy or any of the Straw Hats to ensure Robin continued to cooperate with them. In short, yes, Tekkai and Shigan are users of armament, as heavily implied by multiple official sources. Specifically, there are likely some basic hardening of the Haki inside the body, not as an external coating. And no, this is not a retcon. They were never described as being anything other than armament, and they were always meant to be armament because they are literally based on and named after the same Qigong techniques that armament as a whole is based on. Of course, if you can add binding forces to your Haki to change its phase and especially to solidify it, then it should mean that with enough control over it, you should be able to control its mechanical properties. For a solid, that means to control its strength and rigidity, the Haki's resistance to being deformed by forces applied on it. And this is the key to gear. 4th. Now these days, increasingly, I see people saying that it is just headcanon, that the essence of Gear 4th is Luffy controlling the elasticity of his rubber with Armament Haki. And the main purpose of doing this is to say that actually Gear 4th was never explained, and that its unconventional behavior was proof all along that Luffy did not have rubber powers, and that this was all actually some mythical Zoan Nika imagination magic or whatever. But the biggest one at fault here is probably whoever translated this specific panel during Luffy's fight with Doflamingo. In the official translation, Doflamingo states that Luffy can control the elasticity of his rubber even in an Armament Haki state. And so of course, people argue that Doflamingo is just commenting on how Luffy is able to maintain his body rubbery even when using Armament Haki. The problem is, this is a pretty terrible translation. You see, in the original Japanese, Doflamingo specifically uses the connective particle de. I don't mean to bore you too much with explanations on language, but this connective particle here specifically denotes either the means through which an action is accomplished or the location where the action takes place. In this case, from the context, it's obvious that it refers to the former. Specifically here, the action that is accomplished is the control of the expansion and contraction, or the elasticity of rubber at will, and the means through which this is accomplished is Armament Haki. Doflamingo is literally stating here that Luffy is able to control the expansion and contraction, or the elasticity of his rubber, through Armament Haki, which is why he calls it a fusion of armament and rubber. This is the explanation that he comes up with for how Luffy is able to change the trajectory of his punch in all these different directions and make his rubber continue stretching when it should be shrinking, which is in line with what he had concluded in the previous chapter, that Luffy is hardening his skin with Armament Haki and using the tensile force to raise his power by several times. Doflamingo notes that even with Armament Haki, Luffy remains rubbery. This can refer to two different things, either to how Luffy's body remains rubbery even when hardened with Armament Haki, and this is due to how Luffy uses hardening in a fine-tuned way to increase the elastic properties of his rubber rather than making it completely rigid, or how his body remains rubbery even though Doflamingo is attacking it with armament coating, which is because Luffy's own hardened armament coating counters Doflamingo's armament, stopping it from hitting his body and thus negating his rubber powers. By coating himself with armament hardening and controlling the elastic properties of said hardening bound to his rubber body, he can at will increase the stiffness of his rubber without doing away with its elastic behavior, and he can increase that rigidity at will for different parts of his body. By selectively increasing the rigidity in parts of his body, Luffy can even bring his limbs into themselves, loading them like a spring. By making one side of his arm stiffer than the other, he can force his arm to bend, thus changing the trajectory of his attack. But where does all that energy for the highly explosive moves that Luffy performs in Gear 4th come from? Is it just from Luffy's Armament Haki? It doesn't seem that Luffy should be able to do this with just Haki, when at that point he still hadn't learned to recruit the energy from his whole body with the Haki flow technique that he learned from Hyogoro. Also, if it's all Armament Haki, why does he need to inflate his body in the first place? Why does he seem to put in so much air into Gear 4th and then again exhale so much out when Gear 4th is over, even though he doesn't get anywhere near as large as with Gear 3rd? And what's going on without the bouncing? The answer here is air pressure. Through the use of armament, Luffy is able to strengthen his rubber, and so instead of inflating himself like a balloon, the air is forcibly kept at a much higher density and thus a much higher pressure. This is why he bounces around so much in boundman form. If you ever had to inflate a football or a basketball or whatever, you know that the higher the pressure, the more air you pump into the ball, the bouncier it gets. When Luffy charges up a move, by using armament to bring his arms or legs into his body, he further increases the air pressure. He doesn't have them to use a great amount of Haki at an instant to cause that explosive expansion. All he has to do is to let go to weaken the armament, and then all that energy stored as air pressure does the work all by itself. It's essentially a pneumatic hammer.
Here we go. 1, 2, 3.
So, I compared the effect of armament on Haki to a phase change in a substance. Well, in the real world, when matter undergoes a phase change, this is normally accompanied by a change in volume. Gases, vapors, and plasma expand to fill all the space available. Liquids, though not having a fixed shape, tend to have a more or less fixed volume. When changing into a gas or vapor, they will greatly expand, as gases tend to fill all the volume that is available. Likewise, the transition from solid to liquid also tends to be accompanied by an increase in volume, though this is not always the case, as for example, water, due to its particular molecular structure, will increase in volume when transitioning from liquid to solid, which is why ice will float on water. We see a similar thing happening with the use of armament coating, being what keeps the Haki at a fixed volume, coating the user's body, instead of expanding outwards. So, with good enough control of one's Armament Haki, it's plausible that one might be able to control not only its rigidity and tensile strength, but the Haki's density, its expansion and contraction, and thus also the expansion and contraction of what the Haki is bound to. But do we have an actual example of this kind of control over the armament's volume happening in the manga? Well, possibly. Again, I think we might find it in Gear 4th. Remember that Doflamingo says that Luffy can use armament to control the expansion and contraction or the elasticity of his rubber. It is a bit ambiguous. The vast majority of Gear 4's behavior could be easily and probably better explained by just control of the armament's rigidity. But specifically for Culverin, I think it's noteworthy how Doflamingo seems particularly surprised at how Luffy's arm is not shrinking. Normally, no matter how much you decrease the rigidity of the armament, just from the rubber's rigidity, Luffy's arm should be losing velocity as the rubber attempts to shrink to return to its undeformed shape. Now, this could, in theory, be accomplished by the air pressure, with Luffy just progressively decreasing more and more the rigidity of his armament, allowing the air pressure to continue expanding his arm. But it is possible that Luffy is actually, to some extent, controlling the volume of his armament hardening, forcing its expansion to force his arm to keep stretching. Specifically, I think this might help explain how in Snakeman form, Luffy states that his sponge not only doesn't lose velocity as his arm keeps stretching, but in fact it keeps accelerating. We then also have what are referred to colloquially by the fandom as the advanced forms of armament. There are two distinct but correlated techniques that Hyogoro teaches Luffy: Haki Emission and Internal Destruction. This will likely require a certain fine-tuning of these binding properties of armament. You will need to simultaneously emit it from your body, but still give it sufficient integrity so that it won't just pour out everywhere out of control. There's a delicate balance here between allowing the Haki to flow freely and giving it enough structure to flow in a controlled manner towards the target. To be able to do this, of course, as taught by Hyogoro, you need to be able to control the flow of Haki with your mind, and not just by straining your body. For one, you need to recruit a great amount of Haki as a continuous flow into that one attack, and thus you need to flow Haki internally from all over your body, and then control this flow even outside the body to form a continuous coherent blast. But what is it that allows the Haki to not hit the target on impact, but instead seemingly phase through their body until it is inside, and only then interact with the target? Well, I do find it interesting that when first explaining the one understanding of Haki, Yuo, Hyogoro specifically talks about how it is the power that allows swordsmen to cut only what they wish to cut and nothing else. While this is useful in establishing the use of the breath of all things as a form of Haki, I think it's also noteworthy that Hyogoro is specifically drawing attention to this ability to only harm what you wish to harm before teaching Luffy about internal destruction, because in a way, the principle of internal destruction is very similar. It only harms the target when and where the user wishes to cause harm, phasing through the surface of the enemy's body unaffected. In the same way that Conqueror's coding could be a combination of Armament and Conqueror's Haki, internal destruction could be utilizing the properties of both Armament and Nature Haki, in the sense that the user changes the nature of their Haki to not interact with the outside of the target's body and then to violently clash with the target's insides. This also thematically would tie nicely with what I said about Chopper's Panacea in the Nature Haki video, where I claimed that Chopper would need to flow his Haki into the patient's body and tune itself to it in order to control it, except in a harmonious way rather than the disharmonious way of internal destruction, and how that would create the connection between Hiruru's cherry blossom and the meaning of Ryuo as cherry blossom flow, mentioned precisely by Hyogoro when teaching Luffy about emission and internal destruction. Is Armament Haki invisible to the naked eye, even hardening, or is hardening visible? Does Oda only add this black coding as a visualization for his readers that a character is using hardening? Or people using hardening coding pre-time skip like in Marineford, and it was invisible to us because we were following Luffy's perspective, who couldn't see or sense this hardening due to not using observation. Is this how Luffy looks like in Gear 4 to non-users of observation Haki? Actually, does hardening even look like a black coding to observation Haki users, or do they also see Gear 4 like that and merely sense the hardening in a non-visual way? I wish there were easy answers to all these questions, so there wouldn't be endless discussions about them. Unfortunately, there aren't. But what about when Rayleigh removes Kami's color using internal destruction? In Wano, when we flash back to it, we see Rayleigh's hand with that black coating, but in pre-time skip we don't see it. So clearly this means the hardening wasn't visible. Yeah, unfortunately we actually don't see Rayleigh's hand at all pre-time skip when it is touching Kami's collar, so we can't actually tell it from the scene. But what about Marineford? There are tons of characters using Armament Haki and none of it was colored with a black coating. Sure, but again, hardening is what is depicted with the black coating. And again, you don't have to be using hardening to be using Armament Haki. Even post time skip for non-hardened armament, Oda will frequently have it invisible, only sometimes he will depict it as an aura. But what about Tekkai and Shigan? I said it was armament hardening, right? And there was no black coating pre-time skip, so hardening must not be visible. Except, I did say that this is hardening of the Haki inside of the body, right? It's not clear to me that this hardening of the Haki inside of the body would be visible in any way with the black coloring, like an external, superficial coating of hardening is. Post time skip, we have seen uses of Shigan and Tekkai accompanied by black coating, but it's from Who's Who and post time skip Lucci, both of whom I assume can do armament coding and are more likely than not using said armament coding in conjunction with the Rokushiki. So there's no way to tell if this black coloring is coming from Tekkai and Shigan. So let's try to look at the evidence we do have. Firstly, non-hardening armament, whether it is coding or emission, is absolutely invisible to the naked eye, though it can be perceived by observation Haki users and is visually shown to us readers quite often nowadays as a transparent aura. But again, not always. Even post-time skip, non-hardening coding is still frequently shown invisible. Before Rayleigh explaining armament as an invisible armor, there are blatant uses of armament coding and even emission that are invisible to the reader, which adds weight to the idea that even hardened coding could also have been used pre-time skip and we simply couldn't see it. Hardened coding does seem like it is visually perceived as a black coding by users of observation. Hyogoro, who is a user of observation, knows that Gear 4 Luffy looks like a wisdom king from Buddhist mythology. The main physical attribute that Gear 4 Luffy seems to share with said wisdom kings is that they are generally portrayed with dark blue or black skin, meaning Hyogoro probably saw Luffy's hardening as a black coating to be drawing this comparison. But as far as regular people go, there's no evidence that they can see hardening. We never see known users of observation commenting on how someone's skin, sword or whatever turned black, even in situations where they reasonably should be commenting on it. When Luffy uses hardening against the Kraken, none of the Straw Hats comment on Luffy's arm turning black. Instead, they just comment on how strong he's gotten. There's no way they wouldn't have seen it if it was visible to them, given how huge and in the open Luffy's arm was, and it's difficult to believe that they wouldn't comment on Luffy's arm turning black if they could see it while not understanding what it was. None of the civilians in Dressrosa comment on Luffy's black coating when in Gear 4 form. They just talk about how big he is and how he bounces around like a rubber ball. The explanation that we get on Armament's visibility is Rayleigh saying that it is like an invisible armor. If a fairly common use of it like hardening was visible, you'd think Rayleigh would have said something. This idea is repeated by Hyogoro, who also describes it as an invisible armor, and his statement here is illustrated both with Haki Emission being visualized as an aura and hardening visualized with that black coating. Unless there is good evidence that a specific form of armament is visible, Rayleigh's statement about the invisibility of armament also applying to it should probably be the default assumption. The one piece of evidence that potentially points towards black hardening being visible to the naked eye is black plates. Everyone can see that they are black, and Mihawk draws a pretty direct connection between Haki and the forging of a black plate, but it's difficult to draw an equivalency with armament hardening even though they look very similar, probably on purpose, because a black plate is clearly more than just armament hardening. Otherwise they wouldn't be portrayed as something so special. Allow me to make a comparison with a different series that also has a chi-like power system. If you watch Red Naruto, do you remember how, at least in the beginning, chakra was often visually depicted for the reader or viewer, but supposedly was invisible, unless it was such an incredible density and power that it became visible even to the naked eye, which was noteworthy enough to be commented on. A similar situation might be happening here, where your typical armament hardening is invisible to the naked eye, but it is possible for Haki to become so dense or maybe so strongly solidified that it actually becomes visible to even regular people. I could personally see something like that being the case for something like a black plate. In summary, is no hardened armament visible? No, but it can be sensed by users of observation. Is hardening visible with that black coloring? Probably not to non-users of observation, but probably yes to users of observation. Can Haki, in theory, become visible? Probably yes, like in the case of a black blade, but we don't know what the conditions are here, and it's clearly something more than just simple armament hardening. So for the next video, I will be talking about observation Haki, the basis of how it works, presence sensing, power level sensing, emotion and intention sensing, future sight, Usopp's long range observation Haki, etc. For this one, that's it. Ciao.